In 1996, Frank, a former police officer, and his wife Carol were shopping in Liverpool in the UK. Carol went to buy a book from Dylan's bookshop, which was situated on Bold Street. Frank decided that he would visit another shop whilst his wife was looking in the bookstore. Before he made it to the shop, he bumped into an old friend and stopped for a while to chat. A few minutes later, Frank finished up the conversation with his friend and visited his shop, then walked back towards the bookstore to meet his wife. As he approached across the road to Dylan's bookstore, he noticed a sign above the shop door which had the word Crips written on it. He went to step off the curb when a small box van sped past him and honked its old-fashioned horn. He noticed the name Cardins on the side of the van. Startled, Frank looked around the street to find it didn't look the same as it did minutes ago. The roads were filled with old-fashioned vehicles that looked like they were from the 1950s. People were also wearing clothing that certainly didn't belong in 1996. Everyone in the street seemed to be wearing old-fashioned clothing from a different time period. The men and women alike all seemed to be wearing clothing that dated back to just after the Second World War. The men were wearing hats and long raincoats, and the ladies were wearing headscarves, and the ones that weren't had hairstyles that dated back to the 1950s. Frank crossed the road. He was very puzzled, as you can imagine, as he headed to where Dylan's bookshop should be, but for some reason was now named Crips. As he approached, he noticed a window display had not a single book, but instead it was full of handbags, umbrellas and shoes. As Frank went to enter the store, he noticed a woman also looking in the window, looking just as confused as he did. She seemed to be dressed in modern clothing, carrying a modern shopping bag. They both glanced at each other, and the woman smiled at him as she walked through the doorway as he followed. As they entered the shop, Frank was relieved to see that the shelves were filled up with books, modern people, and modern clothing. He looked back to the window display to find it was full of books also, not one handbag, umbrella, or shoe in sight. The young woman turned back to Frank. Looking confused, she shook her head and said, "That's strange, I thought this was a new clothes shop." And she turned and walked out back into Bold Street, which was once again filled with vehicles and people from their own time period. The experience never left Frank's mind, as you can imagine, and he decided to do a little research. Being a former police officer, he was quite good at investigating his own strange experience. The information Frank discovered was astounding. Crips was in fact a woman's shop that sold clothing and other items in the 1950s, and was indeed situated where Dylan's bookshop stood in 1996. Also, remember the van that sped past Frank beeping its old-fashioned horn at him, with Cardins written on the side? Frank discovered that there was a firm named Cardins that owned many vans, and had the name Cardins written on the side of the vans. Frank discovered that this firm was also in business around the 1950s time period. This isn't the only report of a time slip in Bold Street. One interesting theory is that the Underground Railway underneath Liverpool runs in a circular pattern, and is roughly underneath Bold Street. This may be responsible for generating enough energy to allow the time slips to occur. The people who have reported time slips on Bold Street always seem to travel no further back than the 1920s. Roughly the same date the railway lines were first electrified, adding to the theory that maybe the train lines are somehow responsible. The Dylan's bookstore was later rebranded and became Waterstone's bookshop. But since 2014, the business left the premises on Bold Street, and as of 2018, the property still remains empty. So what do you think? Are time slips occurring on Bold Street? Or is this all just science fiction rather than science fact? I'll let you decide. Time. It's not as straightforward as you may think. Ever since the invention of the sundial way back in 1500 BC by the ancient Egyptians, we've always conceived time to having a beginning and an end, not unlike the flowing of a river, which suggests that time flows like water in one direction and one direction only, forward, and whatever is in the past is simply lost. But there is another theory. What if I was to tell you that time simply does not exist? What if I was to tell you that time is simply a human construct created by us to help us better navigate our busy lives? And instead, the past, present and future all exist at the same time, in space-time, by adding the fourth dimension of time to three-dimensional space, creating the block universe theory. This theory suggests that everything that has happened and ever will happen exists in different parts of four-dimensional space-time. And if this theory is true, then that may explain why three Navy cadets possibly stepped back in time in the village of Kersey in 1957. Whoa. Listen, okay. Don't panic, this will all make sense at the end. Back in 1957, on a bright Sunday morning in October, three Royal Navy cadets were taking part in a map reading exercise in the countryside of Suffolk in the UK. The three cadets had the challenge of locating a certain destination on the map, and if all went well they would end up in the village of Kersey. With its numerous historic buildings, its thatched and timber-framed cottages, and its medieval church that overlooks the village, it is definitely the kind of picturesque place you would expect to find on the front of a postcard. The three 15-year-old cadets, William Lang, Ray Barker and Michael Crowley, followed the maps and the compasses across the vast countryside that eventually led them to the bottom of a hill. As the cadets reached the top of the hill and looked out over the village of Kersey, the first thing that they noticed was the tall spire of the church, as well as smoke billowing from the chimneys of many cottages down below. As the three Navy cadets entered the village, they had the overpowering feeling of disorientation and nausea, and the everyday sounds that came from a very busy village all seemed to dissipate all at once and vanish, and the only sound that was left behind was the calm trickle of a small stream. The light of day and the shadows that the sun cast down on the village all suddenly seemed to change without warning, like the flicking of a light switch, and the pleasant breeze that was flowing through the air moments earlier also seemed to dissipate, and the golden brown leaves that filled the trees all suddenly changed to a deep, vibrant green, as though the seasons had just changed like that, like the changing of a channel on a television set. And at the very same time as all this happened, the chiming of the church bells also seemed to just stop in mid-chime, along with the chirping of the birds. Feeling a little bit baffled and disorientated, the three Navy cadets nevertheless made their way further into the village, which seemed to be totally deserted. There was not a soul in sight. But despite all this, the three cadets had an uncomfortable feeling that they were being watched by invisible eyes. As the cadets made their way a little bit further into the village, they noticed that they could no longer see the church, which had been such a focal point on their entrance into the village. The cadets also mentioned that scattered here and there in the village there were timber-framed buildings that looked very rickety and old-fashioned, almost medieval. The three cadets thought it was strange how there didn't seem to be any cars around. There was no telephone wires, there was no streetlights, there was no 1950s technology whatsoever. In fact, even strangely, there wasn't one person in sight, not one living soul, apart from a few ducks by the stream. As the three cadets made their way deeper into the village, they noticed a very basic butcher shop. As they peered through the window of the establishment, they noticed a skinned oxen that had gone green and rancid with age, and cobwebs covered most of the furnishings. It would seem that the butcher shop had simply been abandoned, and the same went for many cottages around the area. When the cadets peered through the very dirty windows, they would find that many of the homes were now empty, and they were void of character and belongings. It would seem that whoever left these cold, empty dwellings behind, that they had left in a real hurry. All of a sudden, the three cadets became very uncomfortable. A feeling of suffocation came over them, like the air was thicker and heavier than usual. Disorientation and nausea fell upon them, and a feeling of being watched. It was at this point that the three cadets decided it was time to leave, and as fast as they could they made their way out of the village. All of a sudden the atmosphere seemed to change and beams of golden sunlight came down on the trees, revealing once again that the leaves had changed back to a golden brown colour, and the sweet sound of birds once again came back into existence. The cadets stopped in their tracks and peered back over their shoulder at the village of Kersey, and the first thing that they noticed was the spire of the church and the smoke rising into the sky from the many chimneys of the many cottages. It would seem that reality as they knew it had been restored. The three cadets all returned to the base as fast as they could to report what had happened to them, and as you can imagine, it was met with skepticism and disbelief. But despite this, the boys' stories never changed over the years to come, even though many people simply didn't believe them. As the years went by, the story never changed, and in 1990, now older Mr. William Lang travelled to the UK from his home in Australia to try and find some answers.
It was in the UK that William met with a Mr. Andrew Mackenzie, a psychical researcher, to try and find some answers to what happened on that strange day in 1957. And what Andrew found was nothing short of amazing. According to Andrew's research, apparently the building where the three boys had seen the rotting meat had been registered as a butcher's shop between 1790 and 1905 and was no longer in business in 1957. In fact, in 1957 it had been converted into a house. And as for the church that seemed to simply disappear into thin air, well, it would seem that it was actually built or maybe extended in the 14th century. But here's the interesting part. The building work on the church was postponed due to a large population of the village dropping dead due to the Black Death in 1349. And Andrew also found a shred of evidence to suggest that the butcher shop may have been in business even though there is no physical record of it being so at that particular time when the Black Death hit the village. Andrew Mackenzie's theory goes like this. Way back in 1957, the three cadets possibly encountered a time slip and were transported back to the village of Kersey at the time of the plague. And it was a plague that killed off half of the population of Kersey, which would explain why the town seemed deserted. Most of the villagers would have sadly been taken by the plague and died, and those that hadn't would have gathered up as many of their personal belongings as they could carry and leave the village until it was safe to return. And that would explain why the three cadets found most of the houses empty and void of all contents, and possibly why perfectly good oxen meat would have been left to go rancid in the window of the butchery shop. And it would also explain why the church wasn't visible. Number one, it was simply not built yet because of the plague hitting and the building work was postponed. Or number two, it was a much smaller church at that time and building of the spire hadn't started yet, and from the vocal point, they simply couldn't see the church because of the trees. But then again, there is the fact that this story started with three teenage boys who could have possibly fabricated a wild story. Or maybe the village of Kersey simply looked old-fashioned to three 15-year-old boys who had very little in life experience. Or maybe, just maybe, on that particular morning of 1957, the fabric of space and time tore momentarily. Suggests that everything that has happened and ever will happen exists in different parts of space-time. And if this theory is true, then that may explain why three Navy cadets possibly stepped back in time in the village of Kersey in 1957. Oh. Listen, okay. Don't panic. This will all make sense at the end. But if you don't mind, I need to finish my video. I've not even started the video yet. Don't worry. Don't worry, you will. You will. Okay, thank you. Where was I? Or maybe, just maybe, way back on that particular morning in 1957 in the village of Kersey, the fabric of space and time was tore open, transporting three Navy cadets back into the past. And then, once again, back to the future. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you soon. Okay. That was weird. A couple named Christine and Robin Gardner apparently saw the Lancaster Bomber flying over Derbyshire in August 2020. 74-year-old Christine was parked up with her husband and a friend in a scenic area in Chatsworth in the UK. When they returned back to their car between 2 PM and 2:30 PM, they decided to sit down and enjoy a picnic. As they sat there enjoying their picnic, all of a sudden they could hear the sound of a plane flying overhead, but it wasn't a gradual noise that was approaching from a distance, it was an instant loud sound of plane engines, like it just popped into existence. It was a Lancaster Bomber, and it was flying at treetop level, and it seemed to dip its wings and turn down the valley, when all of a sudden, the Lancaster Bomber just simply vanished. It popped back out of existence, and the sound that was coming from the engine also ceased instantly. A little freaked out, Christine and her husband went on to inquire whether there was any Lancaster Bombers flying in the area that day. But no one confirmed this to be the case, and even if there was, it still doesn't explain how a plane can simply vanish into thin air. And then they asked around the area they were in, they asked random people, but it seemed that no one had seen this Lancaster flying overhead, something that would have definitely caught your eyes and your ears. To this day, the couple still stand by what they believe they saw that day, even if no one else believes them. After all, the chances of seeing a real Lancaster Bomber are quite rare considering there are only 2 that are operational and are able to fly. Is it possible that the couple saw another recording of time replay for them to see? And if so, it does not explain why no one else saw the plane. Now, after I read this story, it got me thinking about another story I've heard many years ago about time rifts in the sky, but from the pilot's perspective. I remember reading about one pilot who was flying his plane one day and he flew over this airbase, and the pilot was really confused by what he was seeing because this airbase should not have existed. The airbase he was looking at existed maybe, I can't remember exactly, but let's say 40 years ago in the past, and since it had been demolished. And he was totally confused by how he was seeing this, but he just went on with his journey. On the way back, it was as if reality had restored itself and the airbase was once again gone, like it should be. Is it possible that that pilot somehow travelled back in time up in the sky and then travelled back to his time on the way back? And if that is so, could the couple have witnessed a time slip? Is it possible that they saw a pilot from World War II who had suddenly been transported into 2020 for the briefest of moments before being sent back to his own time? Maybe. Or is it possible that they actually did see a Lancaster Bomber and they were mistaken somehow? Maybe the sun was in their eyes, maybe it went behind a cloud, and due to some kind of freakish optical illusion, they were somehow fooled. Whatever conclusion you land on, you've got to admit, it is a strange story.
Back in 2010, self-described paranormal consultant Fiona Broom came up with the term the Mandela Effect. You see, she believed that Nelson Mandela had died in the 1980s whilst in jail. She had strong memories of this, and to back up her theory, she claimed thousands of other people shared this false memory. In fact, Nelson Mandela was released from prison and went on to be the President of South Africa from 1994 to 1999, and eventually he did die in 2013. Here are some more examples of the Mandela Effect. The Mona Lisa smile. There are so many people who claim that they remember the Leonardo da Vinci portrait of Mona Lisa having a more eye-catching, prominent smile, a bigger smile. Flintstones as 2 T's. Most people remember the Flintstones being spelt with only 1 T, for example, F-L-I-N-S-T-O-N-E-S, when in fact it's spelled F-L-I-N-T-S-T-O-N-E-S. I must admit, the latter is how I remember it. Forrest Gump. Life is like a box of chocolates is actually not what Forrest Gump said in the movie. He says life was like a box of chocolates, and I must admit I actually remember it as life is like a box of chocolates.
Life was like a box of chocolates.
Here's another movie line people seem to remember differently. It was spoken in Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Rings. Deep in the mines of Moria, Gandalf fights the Balrog, but just before he falls we hear him say, "Fly, you fools." But many people remember him actually saying, "Run, you fools." The US states. Now we all know that there is 50 states, but some swear that they remember learning at school that there were 51 states. Some even swear that there were 52. Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong died in 2012. Oddly, a lot of people say they have absolutely no memory of this ever happening, and I must admit, I am one of these people. Patrick Swayze. Patrick Swayze sadly died of cancer way back in September 2009, but so many people seem to remember Patrick making a full recovery and beating cancer. KitKat. Now we have a few food lines that have been affected by the Mandela Effect. Many people remember the KitKat chocolate biscuit bar having a hyphen between Kit and Cat. But nope, it never did. Jif peanut butter. The peanut butter Jif is believed to be affected by the Mandela Effect. Many remember it being called Jiffy, not Jif, but some believe there's confusion between the rival peanut butter Skippy, and people may just be combining the words Jif and Skippy together to get Jiffy. Looney Tunes. Apparently, Looney Tunes has been affected by the Mandela Effect. You see, lots of people remember tunes being spelled Toons,
tunes. But it never was. It has always been spelt Tunes, tunes. Apparently, the reason for this spelling is because the cartoon ran with musical compositions inspired by Walt Disney cartoons.
Why is it that some people don't remember this?
And next we have Shazam. And here is a very popular Mandela Effect that has took the internet by storm. So many people recall seeing a movie in the early 90s starring Sinbad, which was called Shazam. But here is the thing, there never was a movie starring Sinbad called Shazam. But there was a movie that most have no memory of whatsoever, that was actually called Kazam, which starred Shaquille O'Neal. And here is the funny thing about this one, Sinbad has actually heard of this Mandela Effect, and he took it upon himself to create a fake trailer for the movie that never existed, and you can find that on YouTube right now. Go and look for it. Next we have the board game Monopoly, and it would seem that many believe that Rich Uncle Pennybags, the board game's mascot, has been affected by the Mandela Effect. Now, I've been playing Monopoly ever since I was a child, and I know this game inside and out, or at least I thought I did. You see, I remember vividly that Rich Uncle Pennybags wore a monocle, but here's the thing, he never did. But myself and lots of other people remember him wearing one. There is a theory that people were getting confused between Mr. Peanut, the snack mascot, and Rich Uncle Pennybags. However, I'm not convinced. Does Curious George have a tail? And if I was asked if Curious George had a tail, I would have to say yes, he does. But I would be wrong. He does not have a tail, no tail at all, which is bizarre. In fact, many people have memories of him swinging through trees with his tail on the TV show and in books, as I'm sure I remember him having one. And this is Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now here's another Mandela Effect that got me good. You see, a lot of people, including me again, remember the evil queen standing in front of her magic mirror and speaking the words, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" What she did speak was "magic mirror on the wall." And would you believe Disney have actually released Snow White merchandise which had the sentence "Mirror, mirror on the wall" written all over it? It's funny, isn't it, how Disney also remember it differently. Pokemon. Pikachu's tail. Now, I'm not a massive Pokemon fan. It was never my cup of tea, so I can't really comment on this Mandela Effect. But you see, lots of people remember Pikachu having a black tip at the end of his tail. And I must admit, it does sound right to me, but like I said, I never watched the show, so I can't really comment. But you may be surprised to hear that he does not have a black tip. It's completely yellow. Now here we have probably one of the best known Mandela Effects, the Berenstain Bears. Now this Mandela Effect is actually referring to the spelling of the Berenstain Bears. Now many remember Berenstain being spelt the following way, Berenstein. That's Berenstain. But in reality, our reality, it's actually spelt Berenstein, Berenstain. These books were read by children worldwide, and most people are convinced it is actually spelt Berenstein. This could be put down to kids constantly misspelling the book's title, and that's where the confusion all started. Now there are plenty more of these, maybe I'll tell you another time.
So what is the Mandela Effect? Is it just a collection of false memories created by the brain? Or is it actual proof that somewhere, somehow, two universes have collided and created a separate timeline? What do you think?
Time travel has always been a subject that's always fascinated me. Imagine if it was possible to travel back in time and visit loved ones that had passed, or go even further and witness famous historical events, or perhaps travel forwards to see what world would be like in 100 years. At the moment, of course, all of this is just fantasies, But some of the greatest minds on the planet think that this could be possible, in theory. But what if nature doesn't require a H.G. Wells time machine, or a plutonium-powered DeLorean? What if time slips occurred naturally all around us? What if, say, one day we were taking a stroll, and suddenly we find ourselves 75 years back in the past? That may just have happened to one man featured in today's episode, and his name was Rudolph Fentz. The story of Rudolph Fentz is said to have first come into the public's attention in a 1951 science fiction short story written by a Mr. Jack Finney. The short story told of a man who it seemed was taken from his own time and appeared dazed and confused in the middle of a 1950s Times Square in New York. For years the story was believed to be true, and it quickly became an urban legend, and the book it was published in long forgotten. The tale became very popular in the 1980s, and then eventually with the introduction of the internet in the 1990s, it was available around the world, where it was reported and presented as fact and evidence of time travel. Even though this short story has been sourced to the 1951 publication, it is believed by some to be a true account, and the mention of the 1951 publication is just another means to cover up the story and the facts. Now, the story may be true, it may be false, but as always, I'll leave that up to you to decide. Here is the story of Rudolph Fentz, the Times Square time traveller. In June 1950, a man suddenly appeared out of thin air in the centre of New York City's Times Square. His clothing was old-fashioned, even for 1950. Also, the man's hairstyle and the grooming of his beard also seemed out of fashion for that time period. For a few seconds he looked around in astonishment and utter fear, and without warning he broke out into a panic-fueled sprint. He ran into the road and was hit and killed instantly by a passing car, and the mystery followed him to the grave. When the police arrived and searched the body, they found a copper token for a beer that was worth 5 cents, which had the name of a saloon printed on the side, a bill for the care of a horse and the washing of a carriage from a livery stable. The address on the bill read Lexington Avenue. This address was not listed in any address book. He had about $70 in outdated banknotes, a few business cards with the name Rudolph Fentz written on the side, as well as his address on Fifth Avenue, a letter sent to the same address on the business cards, and finally, a medal for coming third in a three-legged race. All of these antiquity items had no sign whatsoever of aging on them. The Missing Persons Department of the NYPD tried to identify this unknown man with the items on his person. The current owner of the address on the card had never heard of Rudolph Fentz, and his name was not listed on the address. Also, his fingerprints were not recorded anywhere, and no one had reported him missing. Eventually, a Mr. Rudolph Fentz Jr. was discovered after some extensive investigation. The name was found in a telephone book, which was dated 1939. The residence of Rudolph Fentz Jr. was tracked down, and the residents of the apartment there remembered a 60-year-old man who went by the same name, but unfortunately he had moved away in 1940 to an unknown location. The local bank was then contacted. The investigator was told, unfortunately Rudolph Fentz Jr. had passed away 5 years previous, but the address of his widow was discovered, who was alive and well living in Florida. The investigator contacted Rudolph Fentz Jr.'s widow and discovered that her late husband's father, Rudolph Fentz, had disappeared in 1876, aged 29 years old. It is said that one night in 1876, Rudolph Fentz had left the house for an evening stroll, but he never returned. Search parties were led to find him, but no body was ever found. It was as if Rudolph Fentz had simply disappeared. Upon checking the missing person file, the investigator discovered that the description of the missing man in 1876 matched up perfectly to the dead man he now had in his morgue that seemed to have just appeared out of thin air in the middle of Times Square, New York, almost 75 years later. So, was this time travel story fiction or true? Was there ever a Rudolph Fentz who was accidentally thrown 74 years into the future by some unnatural cause of nature only to meet his end by being hit by a car? Or was this pure fiction that was at some point in its many publications presented wrongly as possible fact to sell more books? Or maybe, just maybe, the truth was turned into a short story to cover up what may have really happened at Times Square, New York in 1950. But as always, I'll let you decide. Take care. I'll see you next time.